continue this week in Deuteronomy chapter 2. And we're going to begin with the instruction from verse 24 for Israel to commence the occupation of the land of Canaan. Or put in another way, they're going to fire the first volley in God's holy war. So let's reread from in chapter 2 from verse 24 to the end of the chapter. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, that's going to put you on page 198. We're going to start at verse 24 of chapter 2. Get up, get moving, cross the Arnon Valley. Here, I have put in your hands Sihon the Amorite, king of Heshbon and his land. Commence the conquest, begin the battle. Today I will start putting the fear and dread of you into all the peoples under heaven, so that the mere mention of your name will make them quake and tremble before you. I sent envoys from the Kedemot desert to Sihon, king of Heshbon, with a peaceable message. Let me pass through your land. I'll keep to the road, turning neither right nor left. You can sell me food to eat for money and give me water to drink for money. I only want to pass through. Do as the people of Esau did in Seir, and the Moabites living in Ar did with me, until I crossed the Jordan into the land Adonai our God is giving us. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, would not let us pass through his territory, because Adonai your God hardened his spirit and made him stubborn, so that he could hand him over to you, as is the case today. Adonai said to me, see, I have begun handing over Sihon and his territory before you start taking possession of his land. Then Sihon came out against us, he and all of his people, to fight at Yahaz. And Adonai our God handed him over to us, so that we defeated him, his sons, all of his people. At that time we captured all his cities and completely destroyed every city. Men, women, little ones, we left none of them. As booty for ourselves, we took only the cattle, along with the spoils from the cities we captured. From Aroer, on the edge of the Arnon Valley, from the city to the valley, all the way to Gilead, there was not one city too well fortified for us to capture. Adonai our God gave all of them to us. The only land you didn't approach was that of the descendants of Ammon, the region around the Yabok River, the cities in the hills, and whatever else Adonai our God forbade us to go. The beginning of the war is interesting because it greatly mirrors what happened with Pharaoh in Egypt. The king of Heshbon was offered peace. All he had to do was let Israel march through his land on the way to Canaan. Heshbon, you see, was on the east side of the Jordan River, and as such wasn't part of the land set aside for Israel. Therefore, by God's general will, there was no need to conquer these people. However, King Sihon refused this offer of peace, and he attacked Israel. The result was the annihilation of the Amorites. And verse 30 explains that the Lord stiffened the will of King Sihon. And this was just as the Lord had done with the Pharaoh of the Exodus. The effect of stiffening Sihon's will is that God has marked Sihon for destruction. The die was cast. The New Testament makes it clear that sometime, usually before death, a person who insists on resisting God's provision for redemption will, at God's discretion, be permanently left to his or her wicked heart. The Lord won't pursue that person anymore. Whether the Lord hardens that heart or just abandons that person to eternal doom, it's only a matter of semantics. There is no longer hope, so what difference does it make? Now, let me begin this week with yet another of these great biblical principles that comes from these verses. And the principle is that while we can speak of the free will that the Lord has given to men, there are limits. There are boundaries to that free will. Before we go there, I want to point out yet another means to show you the difference between true biblical holy war and the jihad of the Muslims. We discussed this at length last week. And that the judgments of God against Pharaoh and Egypt are actually a type of holy war. It was a war initiated by the Lord, not initiated by men in the Lord's name. It was a war that the Lord fought as a warrior, figuratively speaking. And the outcome was determined not by human generals and soldiers, but by the Lord's actions. And even though the Lord ordered that the soldiers of Israel, so to speak, were to strip Egypt of much gold and silver, the vast bulk of that same gold and silver was soon to be used to create the wilderness tabernacle and all of its necessary ritual instruments. So the law of harem, which is a central tenet of holy war, played a role. Take a look at last week's lesson to review the law of harem, under which, in general, the spoils of holy war went to the Lord and were not to be used for personal material gain for the people. Now, as for our biblical principle concerning the limits of mankind's free will, now we typically like to say that God never interferes with the free will of men. I think that's a little too simplistic. In fact, we're told on a number of occasions that Yehovah hardened Pharaoh's heart. Here in Deuteronomy, he hardened King Sihon's heart. In ancient Hebrew terms, we must understand that the meaning of the term heart is completely unlike the totally different meaning that we've assigned it today. The heart in ancient times, and this also includes New Testament times, has nothing to do with being a place where the Spirit dwelled or where our will resided. The heart was also not a place where emotions came from. The heart, that beating muscle in our chests, the heart was believed to be the seat of intellect, both conscious and unconscious. Just think of the word brain. The ancients thought of the heart in almost precisely the same way we think of the brain. The brain is the location of our mind. The brain is where our instincts live. It's where we make well thought out decisions. It's also where our knee-jerk reactions to things come from. It's only later Roman Empire Hellenists, well after the time of Jesus and Paul, who started to transform the conception of the heart into a place of erotic love, of affection, and of emotion. Prior to that, it was the liver and the kidneys that were referred to as the seats of both positive and negative emotions, and this was so in almost all societies. It was only these later Hellenists who transformed the concept of love from a form of merciful and beneficent action into an emotion. I'm not giving you an opinion. This is just well-documented literary and historic fact. So if you want to stop being confused about what any part of the Bible is getting at when it refers to your heart, just substitute the word mind, and you'll have it. Now, as for free will. Free will is the human version of God's sovereignty. Free will is the amount of sovereignty over our own lives that the Lord has turned over to us. God's divine sovereignty is above all things, and therefore men's free will is always subject and inferior to his will. Some basic fundamental principles of it. One of the main lessons that we can draw, for instance, from Jonah's experience is that the realm of man's free will isn't really what it seems. There are limits that the Lord has put in place. For instance, it was Jonah's will to flee from the presence of God. But he found out God's everywhere. There's no escape. Denying Jehovah's sovereignty, even his existence, isn't much of a remedy either. There are conscious and unconscious forces that abound within humans that are frustratingly mysterious. Paul writes about some of these forces in this way. When I want to do, this is in Romans 7, when I want to do right, I do evil. For I delight in the laws of the Lord, deep inside my inmost self, but I see in my body parts another law that is at war with the laws of my mind, and it makes me captive to the law of sin which dwells in my flesh. Paul is speaking at least partly of our free will and how it seems so susceptible to the influence of yet other forces. And indeed, that is what we see when we read of the Lord hardening men's wills against the Lord for the purpose of exacting the Lord's justice and the Lord's purposes using these same men. The Pharaoh of the Exodus was not a stupid man. After the almost complete destruction of Egypt and the self-evident invincibility of the God of the Hebrews, he still sought to do battle with the Lord, and it resulted in the annihilation of Pharaoh's army and a loss of world-class status for Egypt and for the Pharaoh. King Sihon of Heshbon, he knew full well his army was no match for Israel's. Forget any spiritual element. Israel's military outmanned Sihon's probably 100 to 1. It was suicide to take on Israel, and King Sihon knew it. But in some inscrutable combination of Jehovah delving into the king's unconscious mind, combined with the king's own stubborn pride and Middle Eastern mindset, the king did exactly what God determined he wanted done. The Greeks well recognized this phenomenon, and they wrote extensively about it in their classic literature. The theme was that somehow history unfolds in a way that seems so full of serendipity when it's happening. But in retrospect, there is obviously some predetermined destiny that's being played out. But predetermined by whom? To what preordained conclusion is history heading? And in the end, history is nothing more than God working within the lives of humans, and that somehow in concert with the working out of men's free wills. And it is all working towards an end that he set in stone eons ago. So despite the flowery statements and the ear-tickling philosophies and religious doctrines men have created about how free will works, our free wills are not entirely free. And by the way, they're not all that well understood. So let's move on to Deuteronomy chapter 3. Deuteronomy chapter 3, page 199, if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 1. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us with all his people to fight at Edrei. And Adonai said to me, "Don't be afraid of him, for I've handed him and all his people and all his territory over to you. So you will do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorite, who lived in Heshbon." So Adonai also handed over to us Og, the king of Bashan, with all of his people, and we defeated him until he had no one left. And at that time we captured all of his cities. There was not one city of theirs that we didn't capture. There were 60 cities, all the region of Argob. the kingdom of Og and Bashan, all of them fortified cities with high walls and gates and bars, in addition to a great number of unwalled towns. We completely destroyed them, as we did with Sihon, king of Heshbon, annihilating every city, men, women, little ones. But we took all the livestock, along with the spoil from the cities, as booty for ourselves. At that time, we captured the territory of the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, between the Arnon Valley and Mount Hermon. The Hermon, which the Zidonim, the Sidonites, called Sirion, and the Amorites called Senir. All the cities of the plain, all Gilead, all Bashan, as far as Salcah and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og and Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, was the last survivor of the Rephaim. His bed was made of iron. It is still in Rabbah with the people of Ammon. It was 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, using the normal cubit. Of this land, we took possession of them. I assigned to the Reubenites and the Gadites the territory extending from Aroer and along the Arnon Valley, together with half the hill country of Gilead, including its cities. The rest of Gilead and all of Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh. The whole region of Argob, together with all of Bashan, form what is called the land of the Rephaim. Jair, the son of Manasseh, took all the region of the Argob as far as the border with the Geshurites and the Maacaites. He named this whole area, including Bashan, after himself. It remains Havot Jair to this day. Now I gave Gilead to Machir, and to the Reubenites, and to the Gadites I gave the territory of Gilead, to the Arnon Valley, with the middle of the valley as the border, as far as the Yabok River, which is the border with the people of Ammon. The Arabah, too, the Jordan being its border, from Kinneret to the sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah to the east. At that time I gave you this order. Adonai your God has given you this land to possess, but all of you who are fit to fight must cross over, armed, ahead of your brothers, the people of Israel. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock. I know you have much livestock. You will stay in your cities, which I have given to you, until Adonai allows your brothers to rest, as he has allowed you. They, too, take possession of the land Adonai your God is giving them on the west side of the Jordan. At that point, you'll return, each man to his own possession, which I've given to you. Also at that time, I gave this order to Joshua. Your eyes have seen everything that Adonai your God has done to these 2 kings. Adonai will do the same to all the kingdoms you encounter when you cross over. Don't be afraid of them, because Adonai your God will fight on your behalf. Then I pleaded with Adonai. Adonai Elohim, you have begun to reveal your greatness to your servant and your strong hand. For what other God is there in heaven or earth that can do the works and mighty deeds that you do? Please, let me go across and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, that wonderful hill country, and the Lebanon. But Adonai was angry with me on account of you, and he didn't listen to me. Adonai said to me, enough from you. Don't say another word to me about this matter. Climb up to the top of Pisgah, look out to the west, north, south, and east. Look with your eyes, but you will not go across the Jordan. However, I commissioned Joshua. Encourage him, strengthen him, for he will lead this people across. He will enable them to inherit the land that you will see. So we stayed in the valley across from Beit Peor. The first third or so of Deuteronomy chapter 3 is basically a repeat of Numbers chapter 21 and the account of the victory over Og and what happened immediately afterwards. Now I want to remind you of the reason for what seems to simply be a repetition of events. At this moment, Moses is speaking to the new generation of Hebrews, a second generation of the Exodus. The older generation, that first generation of the Exodus, all of whom had been eyewitnesses to the 10 plagues, and they had celebrated that first Passover and walked through that opening in the Dead Sea. Wow, was that a day? They were now dead and gone. And that was a prerequisite for Israel being allowed to enter and possess the Promised Land. The majority of the generation Moses is now addressing in Deuteronomy is getting a history lesson, because they had either not been born, or they until after the great events he was speaking about, or they were very young children when these things originally occurred, and they couldn't really comprehend the significance of everything that had happened. Now, this is the reason that while the stories of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers are essentially the same as what is being retold in Deuteronomy, some of the details, the points of emphasis, and the presentation of it, it's all a little bit different because the circumstances are different. You don't address the people who are in the middle of a current event in the same way you recount those stories to a later generation as a past history for them. Something that happened to somebody else. And Moses says that Israel marched north. They encountered King Og of Bashan, and they defeated him. And Bashan was an area of the Transjordan, east of the Jordan River, slightly to the north and northeast of what would eventually be called the Galilee. This area was highly fertile. It contained ideal pasture land, and it was very well forested. There were 60 towns in Bashan, probably just a round number, all of which were either walled cities or at least somewhat fortified towns, along with an undisclosed but a larger number of small unwalled villages, all of which were seized by Israel. A walled city indicated the presence of a sizable number of people and a pretty high degree of urbanization. For there to be several of these walled communities means the existence of a robust government and some good planning. For in this era, there was no primitive or disorganized territory of Bedouin-like tribes. These towns of Bashan had metal gates, bars, hinges, roads. They had standing armies. They had well-defined laws. They had a pretty sophisticated government. Beginning in verse 8, we get a summary of all the territory on the east side of the Jordan now we're talking about, seized by Israel. And it begins as far north as Mount Hermon, and that area is still known by the same name to this day, so we know exactly where it is. And notice that Deuteronomy says that Mount Hermon was also called Hermon Sirion, which was the Sidonian language, and Senir by the Amorites. Now, I've stated on numerous occasions that we have to watch carefully in the Bible as we thumb through the pages of history, because we're going to see the same place called by different names due to actual name changes, and the name is often recorded according to how it was called by several different languages. The conquered area referred to in verse 10 as the tableland means the Moabite plateau that eventually became the territory of Reuben. And it was there where the namesake of the book of Ruth was born. Now, recalling our discussion last time about a classification of people called Rephaim, we are told that King Og was actually the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. At least he was in that region. And the Rephaim were kind of the post-flood version of the Nephilim, a race of evil and unusually large men. In fact, verse 11 says, talks about King Og's iron bed, which resides in what is known as present-day Amman, Jordan, and that it is 13 or 14 feet long and 6 feet wide. Of course, a decent bed is usually bigger than the man who uses it, but it also indicates just how tall King Og must have been. And completely independent Egyptian records from that same era also makes mention of this same king's enormous bed and the astounding finding of several skeletal remains of humans in the region of Bashan who were all about 9 feet tall. Now Moses next recalls how he agreed to give much of the area of the kingdom of Sihon to the Israelite tribe of Gad, and other parts of it to a group of clans who represented about half of the population of the tribe of Manasseh, because they had determined that they didn't want to go into the land of Canaan. Instead, they wanted the pasture lands of Sihon because they had big herds of goats and sheep. They liked the land. It was perfect for it. And by way of further explanation, this same section says that the district known as Argob was assigned to Yair, son of Manasseh, and the district known as Gilead was assigned to another son of Manasseh called Machir. At this time, both Jair and Machir were not specific men, they were clan names of those who were descendants of those two men. So Jair and Machir were the two dominant clans of Manasseh who decided they preferred the Transjordan to the land of Canaan. Other clans of Manasseh decided they did want to cross the Jordan along with the other tribes of Israel. This is probably a good time, by the way, to mention that the term son, like in Yair, son of Manasseh, in Hebrew is Ben. So in Hebrew, the meaning is that this land was given to Yair ben Manasseh, Jair, son of Manasseh. In this context, son is not always used the way we typically think of it. In the Bible, the term ben, son, as often as not refers to a grandchild, or can be as general as any male member of a certain clan. Only occasionally does son refer to the direct male offspring, such as Solomon, son of David, Solomon ben David. By way of further description of the land that was conquered by Israel, verse 17 says, they took the region beginning at Kinnereth and continuing on down to the Dead Sea. For those of you who have made a pilgrimage to Israel, you'll perhaps recognize the name Kinnereth. It's an alternative, a much more ancient name for the Sea of Galilee. And it's still in use, by the way, to this day. Now, next, Moses reminds the people that the condition for granting Reuben and Gad and those two clans of Manasseh the rights to these conquered territories of the Transjordan was they had to send a large contingent of their crack troops with the other Israelite tribes to help them conquer the promised land. Their women, their children, their livestock, that could remain behind, along, no doubt, with a sizable army for the homeland defense. But these elite troops could not come back until the job of seizing all Canaan was completed. For many years later, we're going to find this recorded in the book of Joshua in chapter 22. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and he said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and you have listened to my voice in all that I've commanded you. You've not forsaken your brothers these many days to this day, but you have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers, and as he spoke to them. Therefore turn now, go home to your tents, to the land of your possession, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave you beyond the Jordan." So indeed, these tribes did what they said they'd do. They met their obligation, and Joshua eventually released them to return to their homes on the east side of the Jordan River. Now, I want to point out a principle that is sort of hidden in this matter of the 2.5 tribes sending troops with their brethren. In all respects, Israel was to act as a group or a congregation, an assembly. They were to work together for a common cause under the leadership of Yahweh. This God principle is central for all who think of ourselves as God's people, whether it concerns physical Israelites or those called the church, who have been spiritually joined to Israel. In verse 26 begins an impassioned plea by Moses to God to please change his mind about his harsh decision that had been made some time earlier. Recall that the Lord had judged Moses in a similar manner as he judged the first generation of the Exodus. They would not be allowed to enter the promised land. Moses had been given a bit of a break by at least being allowed to lead Israel in the conquering of the Transjordan region, and he was also allowed to see the promised land, but from a distance. Here, Moses once again says it was because of the people of Israel, meaning the general leadership, that he sinned in such a way as to be barred from entering. His argument is that Israel provoked him. That's why he behaved so rashly. But this argument fell on deaf ears. The Lord, it's recorded, says, "Enough! I don't want to speak about this anymore." The justice of the situation is that just as those who sinned in the wilderness were sentenced to die in the wilderness, so it had to be for Moses. Moses could not have been given special dispensation for his trespass, even though he was assigned a high position by God as his earthly mediator to Israel. Moses was still a flawed man who sinned just as other men. Not even God's mediator could be saved from the penalty that was declared so long ago during the time of Adam and Eve. All men would be appointed to experience the grave. No exceptions. Now, there are certainly parallels between Moses the mediator and Yeshua the mediator in this regard, but there are also distinct dissimilarities. Yeshua was a man, even though he was also God. Therefore, death for Jesus was as unavoidable as it was for Moses. However, the statement that Moses died on account of the people did not mean Moses died in place of the people or for their good. Moses was not a substitute of atonement, as was Yeshua. Nor did Yeshua die as a result of being a sinful or a flawed man, as did Moses. Moses died because, like all men, he sinned. Jesus Christ died because, unlike any other man, he was sinless. And so his death accomplished atonement. But let's also not bypass the God principle expressed in the relationship between the leader and those who are being led. Because they and we are inextricably bound up together. It is paramount in God's economy that a leader always does what is right in the eyes of the Lord, regardless of what other men may want him to do. The consequences for standing firm with the Lord are legendary. The reward for unswerving allegiance to Jehovah is often martyrdom in one form or another. Hardly ever does one of God's chosen leaders stand in good stead with adoring applause from the world. In fact, if a man is being applauded and admired by the world, it is inevitable that he is less than a God-led person. The motto of one who decides to accept God's offer to be the leader of his flock ought to be, do what is righteous and holy and let the chips fall where they may. But that's easier said than done, as Moses and all leaders in service to God pretty soon find out. Nonetheless, as expressed here in Deuteronomy, the Lord's requirements of his leaders are not negotiable, just as is the penalty for sin and rebellion, not negotiable. So this chapter ends in a bittersweet fashion with Moses saying, in effect, the reason I cannot lead you into the promised land are my personal failures. I'm a sinner. So, death is my reward. Therefore, says Moses, Joshua is now your leader. He is your appointed leader, appointed by God. And it is he who shall apportion the land of Canaan among the tribes. And by the way, Joshua was not given Moses' full authority. Rather, he simply became head of the Israeli military. Joshua did not become a replacement mediator for Moses, nor was he to be a leader to whom even the high priest was beholden. Israel would not have another mediator in the order of Moses for almost 1,300 years. And that mediator would be none other than God himself in the form of Yeshua of Nazareth. Well, let's start to transition now to chapter 4. And I want to set the mood and the tone of Deuteronomy 4 before we read it. So I'm going to approach you with a question. If you knew with certainty that your time on earth was coming to a close in a matter of days or weeks, what is it that you'd like to say to those you have loved and educated and cared for? What has life taught you that is so valuable that in the limited time you have remaining, you desperately want those who are going to carry on after your death to know about it? To take it to heart, hopefully put it to work. That's the context of Deuteronomy chapter 4. Moses is literally going to plead with the generation that will succeed him to carry on the good work that the Lord has begun. But don't please make the same mistakes that he and their parents made. Let's read Deuteronomy, just first 4 verses. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, starting on page 200. 4 verses. Now, Israel, listen to the laws and rulings I'm teaching you, in order to follow them, so that you will live. Then you will go in and take possession of the land that Adonai, the God of your fathers, is giving you. In order to obey the mitzvot, the commandments of Adonai your God, which I am giving you, do not add to what I'm saying. Don't subtract from it. You saw with your own eyes what Adonai did at Baal Peor, that Adonai destroyed from among you all the men who followed Baal Peor. But you who stuck with Adonai your God, you are still alive today, every one of you. Moses begins by exhorting the people to obey God's laws. Then he goes on to explain why they should obey God's laws. And interestingly, Moses' explanation revolves around a history lesson. Moses says that it is Israel's somewhat recent historical experiences that validate and set in context the reasons and the purposes for the Lord handing down these rulings and commandments for Israel to live by. In other words, the laws of Moses aren't abstract. They're not idealistic. They're not theoretical. They're not unobtainable. They were not set down in a vacuum. These laws were, of course, given in the cultural terms of that era, in a specific language, Hebrew, at a particular time in history, and then the application of these laws were demonstrated in a number of settings, in a number of circumstances, in a number of different cases. In fact, some of the laws weren't even to be observed until they entered Canaan, because those particular laws revolved around agriculture, something the Israelites couldn't participate in while they're out there living in tents in the wilderness. In verse 1, Moses says, they should obey all the laws given on Mount Sinai. Why? So that you may live. Pretty good reason. Moses says that life itself, at least for God's people, depends on obedience to the Lord. And obedience is demonstrated by observance of his commandments. Israel in general took Moses' advice as literally as he meant it. In Proverbs 19:16, we find King Solomon say, he who has regard for his life pays regard to the commandments. He who is heedless of his ways will die. The Hebrews firmly believed that walking in the ways of the Lord not only brought them shalom, well-being in all of its aspects, it extended one's maximum human lifespan. Conversely, rebellion, well, that would bring calamity and an earlier than normal physical death. So Moses is pleading with Israel, please be obedient for your own sake. In a historical context, there were several recorded instances during the wilderness journey when rebellion brought death to God's people at God's hand. In fact, when we consider that since it's only been 38 years since Israel's refusal to enter the promised land, that was when God decreed that no man of an age of accountability would be allowed to live long enough to enter Canaan, and that age of accountability began at about 20 years old. That means that no one older than 58 or 59 years was now living among the Israelites as they began the conquest. Rebellion brought instant death to some, lingering death to others, earlier than normal death to the greater portion of the population. Hebrews of that era typically lived well into their 70s. I'm saying to you that Moses was not making some super spiritualized statement about only the heavenly value of being obedient to God. He was reminding the people that their own recent history proved that obedience to Jehovah is life. Rebellion is death. So choose obedience. Now, I'd also like to point out a tiny word or phrase in the first verse. And depending on what your translation is, it will say hear or hearken or observe. The Hebrew word that is being translated is shema. Shema. And those of you that have been around the Hebrew roots type of teaching for a while, you'll recognize that word, as it has become a traditional name for a commandment in Deuteronomy 6. It is also known as the Hear, O Israel. Here's the point. In our modern English, we make little distinction between the words hear and hearken. We think hearken is just the old English way of saying hear. It's not true. Shema is an instruction to do something. Shema is a call to action. So in our modern vocabulary, listen and obey, or do, or observe, better captures the sense of the word Shema, or its Old English counterpart, hearken. In medieval times, hearken specifically meant that you were to act on what you're being told. Now, just as I have explained in earlier lessons, that when our Bibles say, believe in God, we need to mentally cross out the word believe and insert the word trust in order to align the biblical sense of it with our 21st century vocabulary. So it is when we run across the words hear or hearken, we should mentally cross out those words and replace them with listen and obey, or observe. That's because just as believe has become a rather weak word that indicates kind of a passive intellectual acceptance of something, so has hear and hearken become words that just mean our ears perceive these sounds and we intellectually comprehend them as sounds. That is not at all, it never was, the sense of that word, Shema. You hear and you do. You act upon what you're hearing, or you're not Shemaing. Therefore, let me recite the Shema for you, in the sense it was always meant, and the sense in which the Hebrews understood it. And let's just see if the changing of that one little word from hear to obey doesn't put a whole new light on it for us. Deuteronomy 6:4. Obey, Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. Let me further remind you of two things. Whenever we see the word Lord appear in our English Bibles, in the original Hebrew, it was Yud-He, Vav-He, Yehovah, or as most will say it, Yahweh or Yahweh. And wherever the word heart is used in our Bibles, heart was not thought of in that era as the place where our emotions and our affections reside. The heart was the equivalent function of the brain. The heart is where our intellect resided. In our modern vocabulary, we should cross out the word heart and insert the word mind. Let me read this basic God principle called Shema for you once more, then we're going to close. And remember, Yeshua says that the Shema is the most foundational God principle of them all. The 10 words, the 10 commandments, are based on the Shema, as are all the 613 laws. So it's important we get the truest possible sense in our modern culture. What is it that God's communicating to us? Here it is again. Obey, Israel. Yehovah is our God. Yehovah is one. And you shall love Yehovah your God with all of your mind and all of your soul and with all of your might. That's pretty powerful. No equivocation. That puts a little bit different perspective on it, doesn't it? I hope you see the strength and the passion of that statement and the doability of it. This is a kingly decree that's not to be ignored. The requirement is that we understand who God is intellectually and then let it envelop our souls as well. Then we act upon that understanding with every fiber of our physical and our spiritual being. Hear or hearken are powerful, not passive biblical words. And we're going to find those same words with the same meaning and intent in the New Testament. Well, we'll continue with Moses' eloquent and impassioned sermon next week. So please rise.